Welcome to another episode of Coffee Time. I'm your host and coffee drinking companion, Natalie of Natalie Christina Coaching. Coffee Time is a space where I invite you into the everyday, real talk conversations I'm having with the magical humans in my life. My sole aim, SOUL, is to create as genuine a connection as possible over this virtual platform. And I am so excited to be inviting you along for the ride. Together, we laugh, we rant, we introspect, all the good stuff. So without further ado, let's dive in. I am so excited to be talking all things self-care illusion today. And I need to hold back because I feel like already I could just go down this really ridiculous tangent that takes us in all of the directions that I'm sure we are going to cover. But before we get into that, I would love, Aly, for you to just give an introduction to yourself, what you're all about, all the things.
Yeah, cool. So my name is Aly. I am a personal development coach. I am an athlete. I'm an artist. I love climbing mountains, and my cat, whose name is Sochi. And everything that I do in my work, in my life, is inspired by freedom and fueled by courage. It makes me the happiest when I see people pursuing big dreams and projects and having the freedom to just be themselves completely. That's me.
I love it. And a little tidbit as well. I feel like when we were first talking, we touched on this. We both live on the West Coast, which I was not aware of because we met in the virtual community space. So that was exciting. And we also have both lived and gone to school in Toronto. So as soon as I heard that, I knew we were meant to connect. I have this weird thing where pretty much anyone I meet who does live or has lived in Toronto, I instantly just feel at home with. And so it made me really happy and I'm super excited. And I think already leading up to this, we've touched on some definite similarities we have. And I'm sure even though we are trying to hold back on them, they will come up during this episode. So the people who choose to watch will get to witness that. But I love everything you just touched on. I think it's interesting, the words courage and freedom. Courage is a word that came up for me recently in a kind of workshop that I was doing, and it wasn't a word I'd ever attributed to myself. So I love that you touch on that. Also, I feel like that's a really good loop around to our topic of self-care because, of course, doing work like that, and I know I've shared with myself, really doing the work to support individuals to move into a space of just living in desire. And that's not always easy. And that comes with a lot, and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't want to speak for you, but a lot of self-reflection and unpacking past narratives and kind of seeing what's got us to where we're at now so we can move forward into that space. And so with that, I think self-care would become very important. And I know for myself, it has. So I'd kind of like to open up probably where we normally would conclude of just asking, like, what are some of the self-care practices you have for yourself and what makes them to you genuine self-care practices?
I love that question. Diving deep right out of the gates. Um, my favorite thing, which is probably the most restorative practice of self-care that I do, is making a playlist for the moment. I like spending time alone. It's a restorative practice for me. It's absolutely necessary to gain my energy. But instead of doing that in silence or meditating, I use music. So whether that is a soundtrack to a musical, so I can like sing or scream at the top of my lungs, or something really angry, or something instrumental, those quiet moments to myself, have a playlist, and I love the practice of making that playlist at the same time.
I love that. And I do have to ask, what is your favorite musical?
I don't know if I can choose my favorite musical because there's a ton of the music that I've never seen the show. I'd say Wicked is definitely near the top. Rent, Rock of Ages, Cabaret, Chicago, Pretty Woman. Yeah, You're in Town, Once Upon a Mattress. I don't know. They're all so good. I can't even.
I love that. I love that the list just keeps on going. I had to ask because when we first started this, you touched on the fact that well, where we both live right now, it is kind of pouring rain. And my go to movie when I am feeling sick or just walking down the street on a rainy day is Singing in the Rain. And I will sing that as I am walking home by myself, provided there are not too many people around. And it just makes me so happy. I
Right?
absolutely love that movie. So
I can't actually say that I've even seen the movie, but I do know the song. I know yeah, that's the story of my life. You haven't seen that movie? I'm like, yeah.
you need to watch this one. The reason I tell everyone this is because once you do, you will realize that there are so many other movies that pull from scenes of that movie, and you wouldn't have made the connections otherwise. So, my only knowledge of pop culture comes from very old musicals. Anyway, back to the self care topic. I love that that has become an intentional practice for you. Like you said, like the intention of building that playlist for this specific type of moment. And I also find it fascinating because a couple of years ago, maybe actually 4 or 5 now, I intentionally unplugged and put down my headphones. And so part of my practice of not so much self-care, but just opening up and being present for connection was to take the headphones out of my ears and just listen to the birds as I walk down the street or even the car passing by, the conversations on the SkyTrain to work, and just fully opening up to every connection I could. And for me, that was a huge shift. That being said, I also, with that, have moved into a place where I really value solitude, which is what you're touching on. And I need that. And for me, sometimes it actually is just my phone is plugged in the other room and I am laying on the couch in complete silence, staring at the ceiling. But it feels so good. And it just feels like everything is relaxing and the thoughts just float away. And so it's almost like a less structured meditation in that sense. And it helps me just be present and refuel and recharge so that I can go forward into that space of, living freedom, courage, desire, whatever it might be.
Yeah, no, it's funny that you say that because I definitely I've always been inspired like by music, always like have it playing in the background, but it wasn't until I call it a quarter life crisis, but it was more of a quarter life breakdown. And I realized that I was just taking in too much. Like I was so influenced by people's opinions, what the news was telling me. There was just all this so much external noise that I didn't know how to listen to myself. I didn't know how to talk to myself. And the one thing that I have kind of taken from that period of time is that once I put in my headphones, I am in my own world. And it's sometimes, it's a scary place, but most of the time it's really, really beautiful because I can close my eyes. I create these like new scenes, new realities, or it's just like this beautiful soundtrack as I am moving through my day-to-day life, but it is my space. And it belongs only to me and I am the only one experiencing it at that time.
Ah, I love that. It just sounds magical.
It is.
Yeah,
I love it.
that's beautiful. And so I think one thing that we touched on is this illusion part of self-care. And so I know I had mentioned to you a big thing that I talk about and that resonates for me is distinguishing between the self-care and the care of self. And I feel like what we kind of just talked through from both our perspectives kind of brings those together. So I feel like it might be valuable to unpack and kind of compartmentalize a bit, just to see hands talker. We talked about that before the show. Um, just compartmentalize so that we can really distinguish like what is. And so the way that I would describe it is a lot of the things I see being talked about as self-care to me really become a baseline care of self. So for me, self-care is not having a shower at the end of the day. That's a baseline thing that I need to just be a person in the world. Eating dinner at the end of the day, as much as definitely in some circumstances that can take so much energy. And I know when I have felt severely fatigued or was going through a more depressed time in my life, grieving, that was not easy. Getting out of bed was not easy. I still do for my own purposes distinguish that as care of self versus self-care. For me, self-care has become more of a time structured intentional space. So maybe I have a shower every day, and that's my care of self. But a self-care practice for me, if I were to distinguish that, would be setting a timer for an hour, putting my phone in the other room, and having a bath with no other stimulus and just being present for that experience. And I would put it in my calendar, and that would be a non-negotiable time that I was going to spend by myself. And so that's how I really start to distinguish them. I'd love to hear your perspective and how that process for you has kind of been distinguished.
Yeah, I think for me, both care of self and self-care, they're both on the spectrum of being restorative and replenishing your energy sources. But there are things that we need to stay alive, and there are things that we need, and I hate using this word, but thrive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the actual practice of self-care, I think, is more of a, it involves our bodies, but it's a brain and like heart space, where it's like, where have our energy sources been depleted, and what do we need to do to take care of our hearts and our brains? Whereas the care of self stuff, like you said, is like what we need to take care of our bodies, whether that is eating, sleeping, bathing, that sort of thing, which is like the very basic necessities: food, water, shelter stuff. That'll propel us into the future, but the self-care stuff is gonna be what makes the future brighter.
Love it. Also, just so you know, my neighbor has decided to vacuum. They do this every day. So potentially you are hearing it, and I apologize. This is real life. I don't know why anyone needs to vacuum that frequently. Clearly, that is not part of my care of self routine. Uh, anyway, I really like that kind of distinction between physical and then kind of mind heart. I think that's really powerful, and I haven't looked at it that way before, but it definitely does resonate. And I feel like that's even because my first thought when you said that, I was like, oh, but going to the gym can be self-care. But I think it is very much that sometimes that same practice can be approached from a purely physical standpoint. Even meditation can be, well, I meditate 5 minutes a day every day, so it just is, but it becomes more intentional self-care when we do something a little bit extra or a little bit different, or when our trip to the gym becomes something more meditative or more focused that way on kind of that flow state, as people say. I hate using that word too. I really need a better vocabulary. um, but as opposed to going for the sole purpose of you know moving my body, lifting the weights, doing this workout, I know an approach that I've taken in the past was I would actually I would pray before going to the gym to allow me to make my body the best physical vessel it could be for my higher power's message to be carried. And that was, I got chills. That was a huge shift for me. And at the time, also really important for my mental health in taking the focus off of what my body looks like and how it's moving, and focusing more on how it's feeling and how it's being used for this greater purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I mentioned, like, it's like a spectrum, right? So it's like being alive and feeling really good about your life, right? So there's definitely like stuff that like builds here, but then it like expands onto this side of the spectrum for sure. And I know, like, even like talking about like going to the gym and stuff, absolutely moving your body so critical to your overall health and well-being. But definitely, like, I know in the past, like, going to the gym wasn't a restorative practice, it was punishment for things that I had ate, or, I had not kept up with the regimen that I was following. So yeah, being like intentional about what it is that you are doing to make yourself feel good, to make your body work more efficiently. Yeah, it's definitely like all about intention for sure.
Absolutely. And I think you touched on too that you love the mountains and hiking. And I feel like that, especially for me, can be a place where, and I know I touched on, connecting with higher power and whatever that looks like. I kind of use that term as an all encompassing term, and people might say universe or mother nature or whatever, but I love that that is so blatantly a space, at least for me, where I can be engaging in physical activity, bettering my physical health, and being present for this thing that is so much bigger and so much more powerful than me. And in that sense, I feel like it kind of moves towards that thriving end of the spectrum if we're talking in that language of really just tuning in a different way than I might if I went on the Stairmaster at the gym, which, oh, I would never do that. But, anyway, it's kind of the shift that it can help make is like context creates meaning. That's something I love to say. And I feel like just the context can really help shift and define the intention of the same sort of activity.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. And I think yeah, I do love being in the mountains. It's fantastic. I wish it was a more fuller part of my like self-care practice, but yeah, when you're there, there's so many beautiful metaphors for life in nature. Whether that is like in a park or it is in the like big wild, right? There's so much to just like sit and like be present and to like witness all that history, all that time, things gone untouched, right? And it's just like, and the silence, or just you find yourself having deeper conversations with people
Mm-hmm.
in those moments too, which is an interesting observation when we talk about what it means to like tap into like that heart and like brain space, right? There's like higher waves of whatever power it is that you're being downloaded. Yeah, it's a really really magical place.
I love that. And I think it reminds me of the last time. So the last time that I went on a hike, we called it short because it was on a road trip. We were going through the Oregon coast and we got to this amazing place to go on this hike. And it was a little bit more intense than I was expecting, not in terms of the climb, but just it felt isolated. And we went up to the first lookout and like there was evidence that bears had been there, and it was interesting. I was with my partner, and I think it was the first time on a hike that I had felt scared. And so we got about halfway, and I was like, it's going to get dark. We really shouldn't push this because we didn't know how much longer it was. We ran into people on the hike, and we all had different maps for the same hike. So that was a little bit terrifying. So we decided to turn around. But I just find it interesting too how, like, if you're talking metaphor, the fact that I was so scared on that hike and that the things that were coming up in conversation were more to do with that fear and how we were or weren't processing it and our different approaches to dealing with it in the future. And even just how I was saying, I want to come back more prepared. And he was like, I'm never doing this hike again. And then I replied, how could you say you'll never do it again? It was one of those sort of back and forth things. But I feel that even what came up from in the moment looking at it was just how we were engaging with the hike itself.
Mhm.
Absolutely had to do with what we needed to process in that moment and how that activity was helping us get in touch with that. And so it's interesting, hindsight's 2020, but to be able to look back and see how that may have been relating to where we were both at in day-to-day life.
Yeah, absolutely. There's my partner is my climbing partner. And we definitely um honor like climbing and mountaineering as what has really strengthened our relationship, because it is like a primal activity, right? To be out there, whether you're hiking or like on a rock face or something, like you get down to the bare bones of what you are feeling. And in those moments they may not be the most comfortable, probably definitely not comfortable. um but it's like the concept of like if your comfort zone is this big and like you scurry out here to do the thing, and it's like it's okay, And then you come back in, like get back to your car and you're like, oh, everything's okay. Like, oh, okay, now it feels like this. That's like what I do in like my work with like courage and looking at comfort zones and things. But that's a really great way of like being a part of something bigger, something like quieter, something more intentional, and having a positive I mean positive meaning like it's enough to want you to go back, not this was so scary that I'm never doing this again. And I've definitely made the mistake of taking people too far outside with my friends. But I think it's an amazing tool to come back home and be like, wow, look what we did. And how like, and if you do that, pay attention to like how your heart and your head feels, because there's this elevation, right? Even if it's just from going a little further than you went the last time. I think that's beautiful.
So actual elevation because you were
Actual.
climbing a mountain. Sorry, I had to. It's interesting you say that, because I was kind of thinking, I'm like, okay, now we're talking about mountains. How are we tying this back to self-care? But I'm thinking too, when I do take the time and when I've had a more, day-to-day practice of meditating and all of that, I can get into that state that people talk about a lot more quickly. And that I think that state can look and feel different for everyone. And for me, it feels like my chest is actually pulling up towards the sky, and I am surrounded by a warm white light. And the rest of me just feels heavy, like in a very comforting way. I don't know if you've used one of those gravity blankets or whatever they are, where they just compress you. They're like a weighted blanket that's meant to help release the same chemical as physical contact. And that's a whole other conversation. But it really is like I am experiencing that sensation when I have that moment, when I'm doing the self-care thing, or in particular when I am meditating and created intentional space for that. And you touching on that just reminds me of I feel like we have kind of similar focuses this way, but a big part of what I've been talking to people about lately is, okay, for example, if you want to know what it is to feel alignment, right? Or to feel grounded or to feel peaceful, think of the last time you experienced that and write down specifically how your body felt physically. So where was it? Did it vibrate? Did it pulse? How did it move? And we can start to make a list by looking back to know how we experienced that. And then in future, we can feel that state first and have that guide our decision, so we can move into a state of desire or courage or freedom, or feel okay going outside of our typical comfort zone. And maybe we can actually open up what that looks like. And it used to be here and now it's actually here. And we can start to test the waters a little bit more. And so absolutely, I feel like moving back into what our physical body is telling us, like that's what I'm all about. It is such a powerful guide. And I think this is taking us a different direction, but the self-care topic can be really unattainable for some people. When I talk higher power, people are like, what? And I'm like, well, I don't know, because I've done a lot of work on that. That's what I support people to do. But absolutely, if that's not your everyday, I think for some people, that space of moving into self-care or connecting with a higher power, as we were kind of touching on, it feels unattainable. It's not tangible. It's not something they've experienced before. And so absolutely, there's kind of groundwork and, a foundation to be paved so that we can more easily get to that space. But I feel like in terms of the conversation we're having, relating it to an actual physical experience, like getting outside and having that experience, that is such a powerful starting point to then be able to bring that physical sensation and sort of that process back into everyday life. And so the next time we plan to have a bath or dance to our favorite show tunes around our living room or whatever it might be, we can kind of start to go through the same patterns to get to the point of having that experience and that chest lifted and opening and the bright white light or whatever it might be for you, because it absolutely feels different for everyone. And to use sort of those lists to know once we're in that moment, we can kind of step back and realize, oh, that's the thing. That's peace. That's grounded. That's alignment. That's truth, whatever it is. And so in that sense, it doesn't have to be so elusive or daunting as it can be. And it can actually be a much more practical, tangible approach to that state.
So I think you hit the nail on the head there. Like I can't say it any better than that, but I think it's a great segue into what I like to differentiate between what is self-care and what is self-band-aid. Because I think there are so many things in the world that will alleviate some of our tension, our pain, what have you, like the things that we are seeking when we practice self-care, but only in a band-aid way. So the things that we are seeking from self-care, relief of that tension, getting to that like heart-centered space, that calm, that restorative practice, we go to things that are easy, that we know will make us feel good in the moment, but we aren't getting that rejuvenation that we are looking for when we practice self-care. So it does feel good to eat like an entire bag of M&Ms, which I'm not gonna, like, I am guilty of. Like, there's a bag sitting right beside my bed right now. Like, I went to sleep eating M&Ms and watching This Is Us. Like, I'm fully aware that I practice self band-aid sometimes, but also like that's enjoyment. But if you are seeking the bag of M&Ms because, oh, this is self-care, it's not. And I hate to like be so blunt about it, but the bag of M&Ms isn't going to get you the energy, in touch with the energy source that is going to restore what it is that you have been depleted throughout the day. In fact, it's going to maybe even put you further behind. But the same thing goes with, I don't know, a bottle of wine or something, which I think a lot of, you know, the trending topics of like, what is self-care, whether it is a joke or not, it's being promoted. Oh, take a bubble bath and drink a bottle of wine and watch a chick flick. And like, all that is like going at your brain. It's not, you know, it'll make you feel good in the moment. You're going to laugh at that movie. You're going to get a buzz off your wine. It's going to be a good, but afterwards, it's not going to have refreshed any of the browsers on your internal computer.
Yes. So, fun fact, which you might have known, but I don't drink. So, I don't have the option to engage with those activities for self-care. And I think the distinction you made there is so important. And it's something that I hadn't fully touched on yet in this conversation, but a lot of that is taking us outside of what we're feeling as opposed to helping us build up a safe container to move through it. And I feel that intentional self-care is to help us move through it and to be okay feeling it, even if it's just for the 5 minutes that we're meditating or laying on the floor listening to our favorite song. But whatever it is, it's about moving into that safe space, that safe container, so that we can move through those feelings as opposed to distracting from them. Because if I'm constantly talking about a thing or experiencing around the thing, I won't be able to have that moment of chest lifted illumination, groundedness. It's not going to happen because I'm over here and that experience is here. And if we're going metaphors, which is funny because I once had someone question me because I couldn't ever understand metaphors, and now I'm just like all about that life. But I love to look at the one of fear, which I think comes up a lot in this. A lot of time, yeah, the self-care band-aid can be because we are not yet ready to move through that fear, to get to that truth, and to have that quiet space, to be alone with our thoughts. Holy shit, no thank you, right? We're not yet there. So we need to go around it a little bit till we can get in. And So I look at it as a tunnel, as fear being this dark tunnel. And it reminds me of that book, Mud Puddle by Robert Munch. I don't know if anyone knows that book, but I love that book. And it's like the person in the backyard with the big mud puddle, but it's like animate and it's alive and can't go around it, can't go under it. Like, what are we going to do? And to me, that's fear. It's this dark tunnel, and we have a choice. Doesn't always feel like it, but when we're ready, we will realize that we have a choice to try to go around it, go over it, whatever it might be. Or if we have the tools and we can move into that dark space and move through it, there is a light on the other side, and that light is our truth. And if we go through, we get to live in that truth 24/7 every day, and it's just fucking magical. And so I think that, yeah, sometimes we need to have the bath with, I'll say tea, because I don't think wine would help me in any way at this point. Have the bath with the tea, eat the ice cream, watch This Is Us, which I'm sorry, anyone needs something comforting while watching that show. I was talking about it with someone the other day, and we both almost started crying just in conversation midday, because that is a powerful show. So sometimes we need that. And once we're ready and we get to the point where maybe those fixes aren't feeling like the Band-Aid's not holding anymore. It's kind of the point of the wound where you realize, okay, it doesn't really need a Band-Aid. I need to let it air out, or I don't know what, like put some ointment on it, something, I don't know. Really focus on the problem, not just cover it up and protect it from the stuff out there. And when we get to that point, we can then move into that more intentional space to step into that truth and be okay with the fear or the discomfort or whatever's coming up, and create that intentional practice.
Yeah, I completely agree with everything you're saying. I'm over here like, yeah, shouting like hallelujahs. Because it is true for some, stepping into those feelings and those emotions that are just too much. Like, it is a scary, scary thing to acknowledge that there is something not going right, right? And it is okay if the only step that you can take in that moment is to put a Band-Aid on it, right? And there is nothing wrong with that if that's the only step that you can take. I don't want to discount it by any means. But the next step is acknowledging that it is a Band-Aid. And it's okay if it is just a Band-Aid that day, but we can take step by steps to get to a place where we can be present in those emotions and get to that light at the end of the tunnel that you're talking about. And I'm not like, I think it's an important like disclaimer for this conversation that a self-care practice is not like an overnight thing. It's like, yeah, I'm going to meditate for an hour every day, and then I'm going to do yoga, and then I'm going to talk to my therapist, and then I will have 3 hours of work to do and eat a green salad and sleep for 14 hours, right? Like, it's not a realistic thing for us to be doing. So at a beginner state, do what it is that you need to do. Use the Band-Aid, be aware of the Band-Aid, and then piece by piece start putting together a practice that feels good to you as an individual.
I feel like the subcaption for this video should be like, the Band-Aid is Yoda. That totally random, like, use the Band-Aid.
That's a great metaphor. I love it.
I think we might need a little more consistency in our metaphors, but that's fine. We're just using them all. Oh my goodness. As soon as you mentioned that, I was just hit with this, a big part of my life was a Band-Aid. Because even thinking back to my drinking, right? And that was exactly it. That was the best I could do with what I had in that moment. And that was me doing what I could to move through and process and cope with all that fear. And then I got to this really big part of basically my whole body was covered in a Band-Aid, and I had to rip it off at once. And that was moving into sobriety. And if we're talking, it's not going to feel super awesome all at once. Oh Lord, did that not feel good? Because I was raw. And that's where someone shared with me, and I think it's a really good other thing to relate back to this conversation about my spiritual growth in particular. We were talking about that and how it's like going up an escalator that's moving down. And so I need to do something a little bit different or a little bit extra each day. And I think that really hits back to that point and drives it home where self care isn't the default things we do day to day to relax or unwind or whatever it might be. It's intention, it's different, it's extra, and it is a priority, right? And so one of the biggest first points that I would say to anyone, and that was made to me, was schedule it in. And I put it in my agenda, 1 hour at 10 a.m., no phone, doing this specific activity. And usually that activity was something that I had not done before or I had not prioritized for myself before because it needed to be different. And the different, I think, was also super important so that I would fully engage in it and fully show up for it. And so that was a really practical first step that I think was super helpful for me and that I also like to suggest to anyone who's kind of at that, oh God, that tunnel is really dark and I don't know where to start, but I know I want to.
Yeah, absolutely. I think even like for me, journaling was a big part of like stepping into that space of like feeling or acknowledging what the band-aids were for. Um, yeah, to like go back and look at some of those, it's like, whew, you're just thinking about it. But yeah, another great tool because you're never going to write the same thing. So just being intentional about that practice. I'm still not at like an hour type thing. Like if I can like hold my energy for 20 minutes on something, that is a win for me. And so yeah, like literally just like reinforcing the like bit by bit, and being intentional about it. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think we're all like, yes, absolutely. All the things. I feel like we're very in sync here. So I think that's interesting too. You talked about sort of that spectrum. And I feel like that's also part of the ebb and flow where I think for me and for some people, that hour might be very daunting. I think also at times it can take a full hour to get 3 seconds of that aha moment. And then in time and with intentional practice, that moment can come a lot quicker. So for me now to feel rejuvenated and refreshed and all those things, it might be, sometimes it is a bit less intentional of a practice. I don't write it down for Thursday evening to do this thing, but on a given day, if I realize, okay, you know what, I need to step back, I need to put down the day to day and do something for me, and I'll lay on the couch for 5 minutes, and it only takes 5 minutes. And in that 5 minutes, I might actually experience that feeling for at least half of that. And so it's almost like creating this big chunk to feel this itty teeny bit. And then in time, the amount that I feel starts to take up the space of the time I prioritize for it. And so the time prioritized might shrink, but the feeling expands.
And I think I also like coming back to the spectrum is that I'm only saying spectrum because like it's like a dynamic, like flexible space. So I think there's a lot of pressure to get a self-care routine like nailed down, dialed in. It's this time every day on my yoga mat. And the one thing that like has been really really freeing for me, as coming up with this like freedom theme again, is that your self-care practice doesn't have to look like anybody else's. So for a long time, I thought that, oh, self-care was like, I have to be able to meditate for 30 minutes in a really uncomfortable position. And I'm like, well, I guess it's not for me. But it's like, no, that's not true at all. Like laying in bed and like being conscious of like what's going through your brain is perfectly fine if that is like the most comforting space for you. Like you do not have to be in uncomfortable positions doing things that like people are telling you to do. Like you do you, and you do what's going to give you the result that self-care is supposed to be giving you.
Yes. There is no should. I have that happen. You probably do often as well. I would assume people saying, I know I should be doing XYZ. I know I should this. And then I kind of ask, okay, but how do you feel and why do you think you're not? And it's just, well, I can't put the time, or what, a lot of the times it's that. It's, I don't have the time, or I don't plan my time well enough to. And my feedback is, well, maybe you're not planning the time because you don't actually want to do it. And your morning routine practice or your self-care practice, because I would say those are different things. For me, the morning routine is that baseline care of self. And then I can move into more of a self-care throughout the day as I want to, as I need to. It doesn't need to look like anyone else's. And I would say it really shouldn't, because you are your own person. And I think the other thing with that is my routines change with time. And I've said this before, like, I love doing a morning reading, but I cannot do the same one every day. And if I had done that for the last 6 years, I would not be paying attention to what I'm reading, right? And so I changed the book or changed the length of the reading or whatever, because I need that to stay engaged, and it doesn't have to look the same all the time. And it seems so simple, but that was a huge shift for me to realize that the original routine that had been suggested to me wasn't something I had to keep doing. And I actually had to grieve and almost forgive myself for that, because, well, I had a bigger attachment to why I was doing it as well. The person who had suggested it to me had passed. And so a big part of that was, well, I don't know what she would have suggested next. So I can't move forward from that. And just, this is where I get all tingly and I almost start to cry. But I think it was so important for me to realize that just because I picked up a different book or a different pen to write that story, or I invited a new mentor into my life, or my self-care practice changed from what that initial suggestion had been, didn't mean I was no longer honoring that person. I was using the tools they'd given me in just this different way that served me where I was at right now. And so, yeah, I changed my book. I changed the pen. I don't do an hour every week pre-planned, but I can still use those tools in a new way as I need to day by day.
Yes. Yes. I mean, I don't want to go off on a tangent, but this is a lot of like the work I do, is that like knowing who you are, but also letting yourself evolve. And I think like I'm a I'm stuck in metaphors. I'm just gonna keep it at this point. But like you talking about like if you were doing the same thing every day, doing that same reading for 6 years, of course you like wouldn't be engaged with it. So if you don't like let yourself evolve as a human being, like of course you're not going to be engaged in your day-to-day life. And I think, yeah, that's like a perfect way to like look at like just your whole self as a human being on this planet, and like you just evolve, just let yourself evolve. And the more permission you can give yourself to do that, whether it is with your self-care practice or your care of self practice, like how you show up, like just grow and let yourself grow.
I love it. So, minus our technical difficulties, we've been going on for quite a while now. So, I don't want to wrap this up. I feel like you and I could probably just talk forever. But I think I already kind of touched on a more like practical approach that's been helpful for me. So I'd love to hear from you, if you were to share kind of what would be the first step you might suggest to a client or a friend or whatever, something practical to start moving into a place of having an intentional self-care practice.
So I think the recommendation that I would give to someone starting a self-care practice is be curious and be flexible and stay intentional about it. So I know we talked about like a lot of things that you can do in this episode, whether it's like going outside and taking a walk, going on a hike, journaling, sitting in the dark, making a playlist. If any of those interest you, follow that curiosity and see what happens. Like don't, or like Google it, but maybe don't like choose like wine or M&M. Like, but yeah, be curious about it and follow that curiosity. Don't let anybody tell you what your self-care practice should look like. If a self-care practice is what you're looking for, just stay curious about it.
Love it. And I want to also add, I think, because a big one for me was realizing I wanted to meditate, but the way that a lot of people meditated didn't work for me. And so meditating doesn't have to be that, like you said, like sitting on the floor in an uncomfortable position, just waiting. It can be a physical activity. It can be guided. It can be a lot of different things. And that meditative state we've been talking about can be achieved in different forms of activity, whether it's hiking or sometimes even conversation. Or a big one I talk about is masturbation. So there we go. Right. So there are so many ways to experience even that one thing. And so I love that curiosity is so important. And I think with that, really realizing that it is an individual process and it's okay to make it your own. And it's okay if the thing we try one day doesn't feel as good the next and you want to move on to something else. No one is holding you to that. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Amazing. I have loved everything that has come up in this conversation. I think unfortunately it's time to wrap it up, but I feel like we may do more of these together in the future. So I love this. But before we do, are there any parting words or anything you kind of want to add in before the wrap up?
Um, no, I don't think so. If you've watched all the way to this point, thank you. Thank you for sticking with us. And I hope that you gain something from it that propels you forward in a way that is good for you in your heart, your mind, your body. Yeah.
Amazing. And we hope that you've understood all of our metaphors. And if not, we can add some notes or something to help clarify that. But Aly, thank you so much for taking time out of your day for this. I have really loved everything that has come up. And I will say, this is a big part of my baseline care of self and sometimes self-care is these conversations, because sometimes leaving my house to meet a friend for coffee is honestly, it's a lot and I need that solitude. And so this is a way to build up that safe container and still connect in a meaningful way. And so I am so grateful that we've made that connection, and thank you so much for everything you have shared today.
No, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity. Yeah, I hope we can do this again.
Thank you for tuning into today's episode of Coffee Time. As always, I invite you to reflect on it all, take what you like, and leave what you don't. If today's episode resonated, comment below or screenshot and share to your social media. And don't forget to tag me at I am Natalie Christina on Insta. And I would super appreciate if you hit the subscribe button to help make this show accessible to more magical humans like yourself. Until next time, I am your muchly caffeinated host, Natalie of Natalie Christina Coaching.